Hi, so as we know, gunpowder is made of three main components: 75% saltpetre or potassium nitrate, 15% charcoal and 10% sulphur. And of those ingredients, the easiest to make is charcoal and the hardest is nitrate. Potassium nitrate is stunningly interesting in and of itself. Now, nitrates actually aren't that readily available in nature. You just don't find big deposits of them. Well, there are two. There's a deposit in Chile called Chilean saltpetre. It's actually sodium nitrate, and it's the result of nesting birds. Nesting birds nested in cliffs for centuries, millennia actually, and all the time that they were nesting there, they would poop down the side of the cliffs, creating mountains, literally mountains of guano. And over the years, this guano rotted down and we get Chilean saltpetre or potassium nitrate. And there is other deposits in China, and that's why it used to have the name Chinese snow. Apart from those two countries, finding deposits of nitrates is actually astonishingly difficult. Now, you can make potassium nitrate. All you actually do is take some ammonium nitrate and some potassium chloride, which is the stuff you find in cold packs, and low salt. You mix the two in warm water, put that warm water in the freezer, and the first to crystallise out will be potassium nitrate, and you see it as needle-like crystals forming because the ammonium chloride is far more soluble than potassium nitrate, so it's a substitution reaction and it just forms. You pour off the salt solution, which is ammonium chloride, and you're left with nitrate crystals. But to my mind, that's cheating a little bit because the nitrate is actually already there. You're just substituting one for the other to get yourself your potassium nitrate. What do you do if the nitrate isn't already there? Because nitrogen, of course, forms about 80% of our atmosphere. Unfortunately, nitrogen is really quite unreactive. It's very difficult to get nitrogen to react with anything to make it form a different salt. Now, nitrogen equally is fundamental to all plant and animal life. Now, there are certain plants that can fix nitrogen. They've got little nodules on their roots with bacteria in them, and those bacteria can fix the nitrogen in the soil, and there's things like peas and beans. They enrich the soil, and medieval farmers would plant a crop of nitrogen fixing crops like peas or beans every 3 years in a field to help that field come back. But again, they're actually rare. It's difficult to find these things in high concentrations where it might be usable, because potassium nitrate contains three chemicals: potassium, nitrogen and oxygen. And somewhere, if you're going to find those things and put them together, you need to have a source of them. All animals, as we eat the plants and eat other animals, break down the food substances, and we create nitrogen in our bodies. Actually, the first product we create is ammonia. But that's actually so toxic that it's turned into urea, which is two ammonias end to end, basically. But it's turned into urea as rapidly as possible, and we get rid of that urea in our urine. Animals do this. All animals excrete urea in urine. So urine is a fantastic source of the nitrogen, but it's not in a usable form yet. It basically has to be converted into a nitrate. So it has to go from the urea, ammonia to nitrate. And as I mentioned earlier, there are bacteria that will do this, and the bacteria live in the soil. Actually, more particularly, they live in dung and soil. So in dung and soil, you will find these natural bacteria. So the conversion of urea to nitrate actually is a bit of a roadmap. First of all, the urea is converted back to ammonia using urease enzymes present in bacteria. That ammonia is then converted into nitrites using a different enzyme, and that nitrite is converted to a nitrate using another different enzyme. Now we understand the process a little bit more. There are clearly certain elements that are essential. A nitrogen source in the form of urine. A bacterial source in the form of dung. A soil so that that dung can be aerated, because we need an oxygen source to get in there, and a source of potassium. Now, mostly people excrete a lot of potassium as well, actually. All animals do. Potassium salts are very prevalent. We use them in our nerve conduction, and they're extremely soluble. So you'll find a lot of potassium around. It's why when you burn trees, you get wood ash, and wood ash is a fine concentration of potassium hydroxide. The potassium's not a problem. The bacteria necessary and the nitrogen necessary are the problem, and we need to put those four things together in an environment where we can give them time to do their job. I find this whole story a testament to our ingenuity, because who would work this out? I mean, I have the benefit of retrospective and hundreds of years of people working on this to be able to say what to do. But how on earth was this worked out at first? Because it works best in alkali conditions. And what they did was create what's called a saltpetre bed. Now, a saltpetre bed's really easy to create. You just get those ingredients. So you get some dung, you get some soil, you get some urine, and you get some calcium carbonate or slaked lime. And you mix them into a bed. And on that bed, every now and then, you pour some urine and you give it some time, going there to turn the bed over to keep it aerated, to keep the oxygen moving through. As the nitrates are so soluble, of course, you've got to protect it from the weather. So what you basically do is build a lean-to, and we're not talking about small amounts here. You need something like half a ton of soil and half a ton of pig dung, and you mix those up into a pile. Then every 2 weeks or so, you need to chuck on about 50 litres of urine, and you need to do that every couple of weeks for about 3 months, and occasionally chuck in a bit of slaked lime in there. So we're talking about large amounts of material for long periods of time. If you do that, you'll actually see the nitrates forming as white crystals in this soil and dung and urine mix that you're turning over and over. And it's not sloppy, it's not wet, it's sort of a little wet and a little dry, because if it goes too dry it doesn't work, the bacteria die. If it goes too wet it doesn't work, all the salts leach out. So that half wet, half dry, you'll see the crystals forming on a clod of the soil that you're turning over. Although we're using masses of material, we're not actually getting that much in the way of saltpetre out. You're talking about something like 0.5 gram per kilo of soil, something around those lines. So if you've given it the time and patience to actually form, your next problem is to extract it. Now, extracting it is another convoluted process. You need some sort of filter. A filter you can make actually is with a bucket with a pile of small twigs at the bottom of the bucket, and then you follow that by a generous layer of straw, and chuck on a kilo or two of wood ash, and then on top of that you add your saltpetre earth, because that's what that material now is, and what we're trying to do is get the saltpetre out of it. Then onto that you pour about 30 litres of water. Give it some time, an hour or so to soak, and if your bucket has a bung in the bottom, which you should have put in before you started all of this, you can remove that bung and let that leach water drain out, because that leach water is the water that will contain the nitrates. And as I say, we're talking about quite small amounts, and we'll have quite a lot of water there, so what we have to do now is boil the water off. When you boil the water off and leave it to cool, what you'll find is the needle-like crystals of saltpetre forming. Now, as a method, it was labour-intensive, it was slow, it was low yield, and it was high energy intensive. So there's a lot of trouble to go to create your saltpetre. But given that we're talking at a time when gunpowder was of enormous interest in warfare and economics, it was worth that trouble to go to. Now, obviously there are things you can do to speed up the reaction. If you put it in one big lump, then the centre of the pile gets a bit too hot, so it was usual to lay down sacking and make layers of your saltpetre bed, so that you would help with the aeration and reduce the amount of labour and increase the distribution of heat. Anything you could do to improve that reaction rate and improve that reaction yield was tried and done. But it remained a process that was heavily labour intensive, and certainly not something we would have done had it not been so important. It was so important that Act of Parliament created the Saltpetre Men, whose job it was to hunt out saltpetre rich earth, because of course this process can be done artificially. But it had already been done in lots of places, like old sheepfolds, for instance, pigsties that were no longer used, abandoned villages, the soil in people's houses where it wasn't over a cellar, that sort of thing. And the saltpetre men would go around looking for this soil, and they had a royal charter to dig it up, and they did, and they would do it absolutely anywhere and everywhere. And in fact, it was such a nuisance that it's listed as one of the reasons that Charles II was dethroned. Thus, I find the making of saltpetre to be fascinating because it's intimately tied up with our economics, our history, our development, and it demonstrates our tenacity and our inventiveness to come up with an unbelievably complex process to create what was an economic necessity at the time. I mean, I believe we could take some lessons from there. Rather than sitting and moaning about stuff, what kind of inventiveness can we display to solve the problems that we have today? Anyway, I thought I would go through that because I think it's fascinating and there are lessons to be learned for us today. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching, and don't get too upset if you think I preached a bit much.